This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Agustín Fuentes. He's an American primatologist and biological anthropologist. His work focuses largely on human and non-human primate interaction, pathogen transfer, communication, cooperation, and human social evolution. And there is absolutely no reason under the sun that yours truly, one MICHAEL COVEL, should be interviewing Agustín today, but I am, and I'm lucky as hell to go down this path. Agustín's newest work, The Creative Spark, How Imagination Made Humans Exceptional. Imagination, creativity, cooperation. Across the millennia, how did us little old Homo sapiens evolve? What was going on to get us to this point? Yeah, that's a huge question. And there's no simple answer, and it's not short. It's not sweet. There's a lot of starts and stops. There's a lot of creativity. There's a lot of cooperation going back millions of years. We often get so preoccupied with our modern lives. And look, this is the deal. We only live one time, at least until they figure out this life extension stuff. But to look at the work of somebody like Agustín, and his book is absolutely fabulous. This is a detailed effort. If you're curious about how the hell we got to where we are today, this is the kind of guy that lays it out. And for anyone out there that has followed my little path, you know that I love dinosaurs. Now, this conversation today is not about dinosaurs, but when I say I love dinosaurs, part of that is also the archaeological dig. What came before us? What can we learn? What was going on? And to go back in time and study how man evolved in his use of creativity, in his use of cooperation. There's lessons there. Even if the lessons are just to kind of calm us down for a moment and ground us, to leave us with the feeling, yeah, we're not so special. Some things happened before us. Agustín's work digging through paleontology, archaeology, genetics, anthropology, he just uncovers so many misconceptions that we all have about race, war, peace, human nature itself. And he leaves us with that big question. What made humans so exceptional among all of the species on our planet? That's the question, right? That's the big one, the exciting one. Without any further of my rambling around in territory that I should not be in the middle of because I'm not properly trained, as you know, let me introduce my guest and let's enjoy the conversation with Agustín Fuentes. I love what you've done here. This is a serious deep dive. I mean, this is the kind of thing where, yeah, maybe people don't initially reach for it because they don't know what it is, but to dive in and to look at the history going back millions of years of human creativity, what a fascinating direction. I would love for you, before we even get into the content and try and dive in as much as we can in an hour, how did you start down this path exactly with this book?
It's at least 2, maybe 3 decades old. I love trying to figure out what makes people tick. And people are the strangest animal on the planet. And as I've spent the last decade studying both what humans do today, what our closest relatives, the other primates do, and what humans did in the past, I just kept hitting walls because the explanations people were offering for why we are the way we are just didn't go far enough. They didn't reflect the data. And so over time, I came to see that we're not just amazingly imaginative or creative or collaborative in ways that most people don't think we have the capacity to be.
You just said 2 words that are really important to your work: creative and collaborative. It's an interesting thing, and I'm going to really be curious to hear your perspective as you map it out, because I think in the modern age today, creativity has really become, and I look at myself in the last 20 years, it seems like it's become more of a solo type thing. But as you map out, and we're going to go back through a lot of different periods here, the collaborative part has always been there, even if we're just building off. And we might think we're solo today, but we're still building off the creativity that came before us.
Exactly. The whole idea of the solo genius. Now, there are some amazingly brilliant people out there, but even the smartest of them, let's take an Einstein or Simone de Beauvoir, or whoever has made huge impacts by drawing and presenting incredible knowledge to us, they've all done it based on their collaborations, connections with others on past people's work. We shortcut and just talk about the individual giving us the point. We got to recognize that it's built on thousands or tens of thousands of people's efforts all together, all making a difference, reshaping the way we can think about the world.
And where you've really gone with this, and it's such a deep dive, is what makes us human.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, everyone thinks that there's this sort of inner notion of selfishness, and people can be incredibly selfish. But something that's really amazing is that humans have, both in and ourselves and as larger groups, the capacity to look at the world, to see how it is, and then to imagine alternative possibilities and to make them happen, or at least to try to make them happen. That's really distinctive.
Let's go back in time, and I'm going to use some examples here. I've got this great chart that prints off nicely from your Kindle version of your book. This human creativity chart, it's really fantastic because it really puts in perspective. We like to think, hey, it's 2018, we're so special today. Not exactly, right. So take us back from your perspective. And look, there's a lot of points in here. People have to check it out themselves. But from your perspective, what's one of the most interesting early points, let's say back even 500,000 years ago? For me, I look at it like the use of fire and the brain reaching modern size. Speak to the use of fire and creativity and collaboration behind that to the best that we know today.
So fire is amazing. Fire is absolutely incredible. And you have to remember, and I think people just for some reason, they know this, but they forget it. Nothing else on this planet creates, maintains, and uses fire as a tool. Just humans. And also, let me point out that we're going to talk about fire really shows up as common 400,000 or 500,000 years ago. That's a long time ago. But there's evidence of its use as much as 1 million years ago. Human groups, our ancestors, were experimenting with fire. But let's just jump to 400,000 or 500,000 years ago. What does fire mean? Well, the ability to create fire changes the entire world. There's 3 ways. The first way is it allows you to change wood and stone and anything you want to make into a tool. You can change the way those objects work. So fire, if you heat up stone, you can break it differently. You can make better tools. If you fire harden the end of a wooden spear, it lasts much longer. So that's a functional aspect. The second aspect is cooking, right? Most people don't give fire enough credit, especially with this latest raw craze. But the truth is, when you heat something up, you break down the chemical bonds and you release the nutrients more readily. So heating something up makes the food more valuable to us, and we get more value from it. We benefit more. But the third is the most important. The third is, with fire, you change the entire natural world. You actually go out of the daylight cycle. You can have light at night to hang out, to talk, to imagine, to work, to do whatever you want to do, something not available to any other critter on the planet. You break the day-night cycle and imagine a whole new landscape of ways to do things.
Now, when you say human, and we're talking, let's say, 500,000 years ago, and you say maybe even back to 1 million years, we're not sure exactly. When you say human, though, we're not only talking about Homo sapiens, are we?
No, we are not. We might not even be talking about Homo sapiens at all yet. So the current data suggests that things that look pretty much like us in the fossil record can be traced back to about 300,000 years ago. That's what we're going to call them Homo sapiens, sort of our genus of species. But there's tons of our lineage, that is other groups that maybe are species but probably aren't, but are ancestral or related to our species that are older. And those are the ones I'm talking about. The problem is we get fixated on when do we become exactly us, and that is not an event. It's actually a process.
That's tough sometimes for people to think about in the modern age, because we have so many modern things that we have, for example, religious conventions, etc., religious beliefs, and sometimes these run completely contrary to perhaps most of the work that you've seen over the course of your lifetime.
Well, not really. I mean, it depends on what you mean by a religious belief, right? So the vast majority of religions on the planet today have what are called sort of faith-based traditions of understanding their origins, right? So, let's take Christianity. You can take the Genesis story. There are two ways to interpret the Genesis story. You could say it's literal, which actually the way it's written, you can't take literally because you have to actually calculate because the dating system is different. You could take that literally and say the earth is, as Bishop Ussher did, 6,000 years old. But very, very, very few people who practice Christianity believe that. Most people and most religions take their origin stories as lessons, as moral and ethical ways of being in the world. Really, our evolutionary history doesn't contradict the vast majority of religious teachings. It's just that most people are told that science and religion are at odds. And in most cases, they're not.
Maybe also, too, that it's the outliers that make a lot more noise, and perhaps the majority under the bell curve really kind of say, yes, of course, evolution is unfolded like this.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Maybe we should have jumped into that right at the beginning. So what is evolution? Most people have this weird notion. Evolution is basically the fact that living stuff, has changed over the course of history on this planet, period, right? Now, there's a bunch of ideas about how things change and why things change. That's the theory of evolution. But the fact of evolution is that stuff's changed, and I don't think anyone has a problem with that. What's really interesting then and challenging, and that's why I wrote this book, is we have all these assumptions about what it means to be human, about what human nature is. And if we actually take the time to go look at our evolutionary history, we find that we're much more interesting than most people give us credit for.
Let me keep you at fire for a second. And another aspect of your work, this particular book you've put together, somebody has to come up with the idea. They have to, some experiment, perhaps they witnessed lightning hit a tree, whatever. We can imagine a million things that happen, right? But at some point in time, it needs to pass along. This skill set needs to pass along. And we can think about this across so many different tool making, et cetera, et cetera. Speak to how creativity generally passed along amongst our early ancestors and the ancestors before our ancestors. How did that happen? It's the interesting way you describe it, the apprentice model.
Yeah. So this is from the philosopher of biology Kim Sterelny put forward this notion, and a bunch of anthropologists have talked about it. When we think about sort of how we acquired all the skills that we have, it's easy in the contemporary landscape in our modern world to look around. We learn stuff, we teach stuff, we directly talk to one another and instruct one another. But that's all new. That's all pretty recent. 500,000 years ago, 1 million years ago, there was no language like we have it today. How did people learn? Well, let's drop back to those three characteristics: imagination, creativity, and collaboration. The same ones we use today, except imagine trying to do these things without language, without video instruction, right? Without the internet. What is this model? Well, imagine you're in a group of human-like things, right, that are our ancestors. You have a lot of capacity to transfer information, but you don't have languages yet. So you're using gestures, maybe some grunts, and then you're showing things. When you have fire, say other members of your group over time have gotten fire from lightning strikes and natural things and have learned how to sort of keep it alive by feeding it twigs and sticks and stuff like that. So in a cave or some area where you are, part of the job of the group is to keep that fire alive. And then it goes out. This is a calamity. It's a trauma for the whole group. And so individuals are going to be trying to sort of figure out how to restart that. And maybe as they're digging around in there, one of the individuals notes some embers still glowing or something, and everyone rushes over, and the panting and breathing on them makes the embers glow a little bit. Maybe that one individual puts two and two together and starts trying to blow on it and feed the fire, and the fire starts up. That individual then has to convey that information to everyone else in the group to make sure that this one capacity, this ability to restart the fire, gets passed down. So you see how there's individual creativity involved, but it is the collaboration, the transferring of this information. And that transferring doesn't have to have language, but it has to have mutual attention. You have to watch and care about what the other's doing, and you have to do your best to convey that, to show that. We do that all the time right now, even without language. We just think that language is the only best way to do it.
Let me bring up something that's, I'm sure for 50% of the audience, at least American audience, will immediately sound controversial. And just the phrase, it takes a village. This will cause 50% of the audience to have aneurysms, and then the 50% of the audience will go, yes, that's true. What's more true than anything, I think, from my perspective and looking at your work, is going back in time and looking. Now, we can have all kinds of debates about 2018, but going back in time, you really map out the case that, hey, look, we all didn't just start 500,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago. It wasn't all just a nuclear family with mom and dad and the kids and the grandparents. This was it was a wide village, many people collaborating and cooperating to allow us, our lineage, to continue and extend.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great story. And it's funny, I really debated the "it takes a village" term because that's so polarizing. But I think it's really important for people to put aside their sort of political allegiances and actually look at data. As a scientist, data are, the gold that we have. This is the tools of our trade. And so what's really amazing is if you look into our past, you find one thing that's absolutely clear from the data. And I'll use another term that's polarizing: family values. And here I mean in the largest sense. Family, caring for one another, actually multiple individuals in the group committing, investing in the raising of young and having each other's backs. That is just deep in our lineage, this ability to care, to commit to others, and to help them, especially those in your immediate group. That is unequivocally evident in our past. And that's amazing. And so this idea that it takes a village to raise kids, there are a couple reasons. One is, you mentioned our brain earlier. We have a gigantic brain, a ridiculously oversized brain for a mammal of our size. That brain grows really, really slowly. A baby at birth still has more than half of their brain development to occur as they're growing, and that no other animal has that. Our infants, and everyone loves babies, but our infants are totally helpless. It takes years for them even to walk. We need a lot of individuals contributing, not just to help the baby live, but also to help the baby learn. It's talking about this collaboration. Infants pick up on the world around them, and it is that world around them that helps them shape, that makes the bonds, that makes our brain do what it's supposed to do. I could go on at length here, as you could tell, but I think it's really interesting that we challenge the sort of contemporary political assumptions about what these statements mean and go back and look at the past and see what it actually tells us.
Well, what's interesting, though, is that when you bring it up to the contemporary period, I think probably there is a lot of data where people would say today in 2018, it probably, unless we're kind of just correlating some data sets and this is not really true, but it seems like in the modern world, probably mom and dad and the kids, that seems to be, for where we are today in evolution, that seems to be where we have evolved to and what we're faced with, where perhaps many millennia ago, we would have had more collaboration, more cooperation. Today we don't. Today it's more the independent nuclear family is where we've evolved to. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I almost, but I would change the term slightly. So it depends on where you are in the world. And for example, you're in Vietnam right now. What's really fascinating is if you look at most of Southeast Asian family structure, that is, if you look at households, you will find that they are extended households. And this is actually characteristic for most of the world still, that multiple generations live in one household and that there are multiple helpers working with the children. And so that, you're right that economically, the nuclear family is our contemporary economic unit. But socially, and that's what I'm really interested in, what actually happens day to day in the lives of kids? Do they only interact with mom and dad? In many places, yes. But the majority of humans still have this kind of extended care network for the kids.
You're spot on that observation of Southeast Asia. But the interesting thing becomes is if you go to the countryside away from the cities, it's 100% how you describe. Then you come to the cities, though, and it's all the single young people coming to the city to try and make the economics who are away from that extended family. It's going to be very interesting to see how, as we evolve in particular areas like where I'm at right now, how will that affect young people that are leaving the extended family, spending 10, 20 years in the city. Will they be able to go back to the countryside? Will they want to go back to the countryside? It really opens up a whole new can of worms, and it's all being driven by economics.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's fascinating. And here it's really important to recognize that our contemporary economic landscape, it's funny because I'm writing on this right now, our contemporary economic landscape, fascinating, has a deep history. That history is very shallow relative to the bigger history of human evolution. And so the contemporary landscape does favor, in fact, urban landscapes favor nuclear family structures. We build our houses that way, we build our jobs that way, and actually the governmental infrastructure in many nations also favors that. That means we need to figure out how to make that work for us. That's the big challenge. And that is a big challenge, especially, as you point out, in a place like Southeast Asia, where the extended family structure in the villages is sort of central to cultural identity.
Let me bring up another slightly controversial topic. You know, one of the movies that's come out in the last 10 years, I think, that really shows fantastic male violence, 300. The Persians meeting the Greeks or the Romans or whatever it was, and everybody, you know, it's just Spartans and the Persians. Why don't you map this out though? Because I think right now the number I hear is something like you'll know if I'm wrong. 1% of DNA across modern humanity traces to Genghis Khan and his brothers, something to that effect. Why don't you map out though? Because when we have all these portrayals of violence, map out over time. I mean, did we really get to where we are today because us males were psycho killers and we drove everything, and everything just fell in line because the dominant male was just killing and marauding all along the way?
You know the answer to that, and it is no. Let me explain. But let's come back later to that Genghis Khan comment, because that's actually a fun one. No, so violence, right? Are we inherently violent? Everyone knows the answer to this is no. The correct answer, or the correct statement is, do we have the capacity for intense and amazing violence? The answer to that is yes. So let me back up here a little bit. Let's just ask some very simple questions. If males, right, if male violence was the way everything worked, we would not be here. We know that collaboration and compassion, caring for others, and working together is in fact the hallmark of humanity. So let me give you a couple examples. One example I like to offer is which army wins, and the 300 is a perfect example. Which army wins? The most cooperative army, the army that cares most for their brothers in arms, or the angriest, most violent army?
Yeah, we all know in the movie.
Yeah, and in the studies of warfare. It is organization, cooperation, compassion, willingness to put your life down for those of your colleagues. That's what actually wins battles. When we turn back and we look at this very carefully, the best soldiers are those that are least driven by violence. That's a fascinating insight. But let's go back to the archaeological record, right? How old is the oldest example of warfare? Warfare is two groups getting together and wiping each other out, or trying to wipe each other out. That's only about 14,000 years old.
I'm looking at your map right now, but it looks like between 10,000 and 14,000, somewhere in there.
That's the first evidence of warfare. That is organized groups getting together with the intent to go out and kill other groups. Now, this is not to say that if you look deep in our history, 1 million years ago, 2 million years ago, that our ancestors ran through the fields of daisies holding hands. Of course they didn't. Of course they hit themselves or hit each other over the heads, fought about mates, fought about resources, fought about all sorts of stuff. But the bottom line, the basic day-to-day behavior, collaboration and cooperation, was more important than violence. In fact, the fossil record suggests compassion for others was more important than violence on a day-to-day basis. What does all that mean? Well, we're incredibly imaginative, we're incredibly creative, we're incredibly collaborative, so we can do violence better than anything out there. But our fallback position, our go-to when things get rough, is to help each other out and to work together.
Let me send you back to Genghis Khan, because I brought it up and you said you were going to add to it.
So here's this great, there's no time to go into the depth of what we really know about DNA and genetics. It's fascinating. It's much more interesting than most people think. So all living humans only vary by 0.05% of the DNA, right? 99.5% of all our DNA is exactly identical. That's an important thing, right? But that 0.5% matters, obviously. You can tell humans are really variable. But what's really interesting is that, yes, you could probably trace all of us, many, many humans, back to some Central Asian groups. But you can also trace all humans back to some sub-Saharan African groups. You can trace all humans back to some Central European. You get all of this variation. And our story is only about one group or another group. You can't even really tell who our ancestors are when you go too far back because the genes are all mixed up. All the DNA is mixed up and we share so much in common. The story of Genghis Khan is interesting because we know historically there are certain instances where very powerful, very wealthy males are able to impregnate a ton of females. We make a big deal about those. But those are so far and so few in between. That is, most males aren't like that. Most females are not involved with those guys. The vast majority of our history is much more mundane. It's a guy and a girl getting together and producing some offspring, not having any major impact on the rest of the world.
It's just that kind of fun one-off stories. Let me ask you a really big picture question here. Years ago, with my uncle, we were on the James River in Southern Virginia, and he is kind of an outdoorsy type guy, and he took me along for kind of a digging. We weren't supposed to be digging there, but there was, because the James River is kind of it's these cliffs, and you can kind of scale them up, and I don't know, maybe it's 40, 50 feet off the ground at the top of very nice estates. And so we're out there just along these kind of cliffs, just digging and stuff. And he had found some vertebrae the size of basketballs, I don't know, whales or sharks or whatnot. And we just started digging around, and we found like 10 connected vertebrae. And it was really just one of those great aha moments for me. I mean, how many people actually get a chance to find? Seriously, right? But it makes me ask the question to you, with as much digging as we have done, as much that we have found out, of course, there's degradation. There's only so much that we're going to keep finding new things. Where do you think we are? And has anybody kind of put this question to thought in terms of our digging to understand the best that we can, and given all of the advances in DNA and whatnot, is there that much more left for us to figure out from the fossil record? Will we find more fossils that will literally change everything? Where are we in our kind of confidence of our understanding right now?
Two levels. We're extremely confident in that big picture that I described in the book. We got the big picture down pretty well. There's probably going to be a few more big discoveries that shift some of the timing, and that's been happening almost every year. But the big picture, let's say the last 2 million years, we've got the big picture down okay. But the amazing stuff are the details, the little tweaks, and we're not even close, both in the fossils and in the understanding of how our genes actually work, and not just our genes, but stuff called the epigenome, all the stuff around the genes. So the next century is going to see a revolution in fine-tuning how we understand how and why humans are the way we are. It's actually really, really exciting. Every year now, right? In the 1950s and 60s, 70s, every decade there was a couple big discoveries. Right now we're talking 2 or 3 or 5 major discoveries a year, and that's going to continue for decades.
Let me throw another big kind of like hypothetical out at you. I'm sure you've thought about this stuff a lot more than the average person. We can all look at Jurassic Park, right? And the most fascinating one is to say, oh, sure, let's bring dinosaurs back. But if we get the ability, if they figure this puzzle out, whether you can bring dinosaurs back and whatnot, gosh, it sure seems like we're going to go down every path of bringing everything back. We really could create ourselves a science fiction maelstrom of just insanity if we do that. I mean, we'd start bringing back our ancestors going back over the tree and see am I completely nuts? Is this very imaginable to you?
Well, I mean, it's imaginable in a couple ways. One, it's an awesome sci-fi story, right? That's the movie I want to see, and there's been some good versions of it. What's really interesting, I think what's most fascinating, is people don't realize we're sort of already there. As we learn more and more about genetics, we're actually reconstructing our ancestors in our own bodies, right? Everyone's heard about that most people have 2 to 3% Neanderthals DNA in them, but most people don't think what that means. You and I and every other of the 7.5 billion humans on this planet are walking around with a bunch of DNA that has been shaped specifically on a particular lineage over the last couple million years. And so we are our ancestors. And so the way we're recreating them, our Jurassic Park, is actually to pull out bits of DNA and bits of bone and try to understand where those bits come from and how they all come together to make us human. That's not as exciting as recreating an Australopithecus and a Neanderthal and like throwing them in a cage and watching them fight to see who wins.
They might eventually take over and throw us in the cage.
Exactly. Yeah. Don't get me started on the new Planet of the Apes movies.
Let me throw another misconception people have out and let you go down the anthropological path, go back in evolution, and kind of lead us forward to today. But, we like to think in modern times here, and look, there's been a great debate in America right now about sex, gender, etc. Look, hey, people say, well, just, it's majority males, females. People like to think, and I mean, gosh, it sure seems like, okay, the lady is over there. She can have a baby. I'm Mike. I can't have a baby. Oh my gosh, we're so radically different. There's nothing similar about us at all, but it's kind of different than that, isn't it?
Yeah, and so this is actually a really important thing, and most people know this. I mean, the first thing to point out is if you're a sexually reproducing species like we are, you have two sexes, right? Male and female. One sex, especially in mammals, one sex has the babies and nurses, and the other sex doesn't. Those are some important differences. There are other differences between males and females. Males, on average, tend to be a little bit larger, about 10% in humans. Males have larger upper body muscle mass on average. Females tend to have more interspersed in their muscle cells, right? So there are biological differences. But if you look at all the biology between males and females in humans, there's way more overlap than difference. And that's what we never talk about, because when we look at males and females, we're thinking about gender. We're thinking about the ways in which cultures interpret the sexes and ask them to represent themselves. And so those are different things. Gender and sex are different. If you're holding two brains in your hand, just your brains themselves, you can't tell which one is male or female. But if you look at how 5-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy's brains are functioning, you can't tell them apart. But you can tell them apart more or less in their 20s, because as they grow, they incorporate gender, and gender becomes who we are. So that's really complicated, but that's a good overview. What we identify as gender, like, oh, this is masculine or this is feminine. Right now, every society has their own versions of it, and there's a lot of similarities around the world, right? So most people think, well, this masculine and feminine sort of ways of being, even though they overlap, have sort of deep roots. And they do have deep roots. But what's really funny is that if you look at the material record, the archaeological record, if you look at the bones and the materials left behind by our ancestors, things that clearly look like modern gender roles don't show up until 20 or 30,000 years ago. Now, that might sound like a lot, but when you're working with 2 million years, that's nothing. Let's go back to that 500,000 years ago, the fire. We know a lot about these groups using fire, about their hunting, about their engagement. We see nothing that tells us that there were behavioral differences between males and females. Now, just because we don't see it doesn't mean it wasn't there. Obviously, there had to be some differences between males and females. There always are differences between males and females, and there are probably pattern behavioral differences, or what we call gender. But were they the same as we see today? We don't know. And there's actually some evidence that they were different.
It's just one of those things, here we are in this modern age, we're all playing with our phones and this and that. And, we waste all of this time on cable news and all this other kind of stuff. But I really think that if we took the average, I can think back to being a 13-year-old guy. If you take the average 13-year-old kid, 12-year-old kid or whatever, and they're exposed to this kind of depth, it's a million times more interesting, a million times more engaging than so many of the things we waste our time on. I'm not just trying to give you a pat on the back, but it really is true. I'm kind of, I guess if I was redoing my life, this would be one of these paths to go down, I mean, I've got my megalodon tooth, I've got my vertebrae, so I'm right there. There's not too many podcast hosts that actually have those things. I actually have a scale T-Rex skull and a scale Triceratops skull from the Black Hills Institute in South Dakota, and they each cost me 10 grand. Why I bought these things, I'll never know.
Oh, but that's such a cool thing to have. I mean, and this is the thing. So let me even, this is this thing about imagination and creativity. You pointed out that kids are very open to this kind of stuff, really interested in learning, right? And that's because for children, creativity and imagination forms a central point in their life. That's sort of what's right in front of them. That's constantly what's pushing on them. But for some reason, we beat that out of children as they grow up, and we expect adults not to do that, right? We ask adults to reduce their imagination.
I don't have that problem.
No, and that's good. I think it's a problem. I think it's a problem in business. I think it's a problem in schools. I think it's a problem in government. I think we need to expand that creation and imagination and let it go, let it run wild. Because when we look to our past, my whole book is about demonstrating how adult creativity and imagination is critical to our success as a species. Right? And ignoring that is a problem.
I sat through a presentation a few years back, Jack Horner, the paleontologist in San Diego, talking about how he was going to build a Chickosaurus. And it was the whole room was 8 to 10-year-old boys and me. So you're right. It's like the young people know. Hey, here's one of the creativity. I'm curious, since you've just got this great foundation on these things. As we're talking about fossils, and we can talk about the creativity of using tools. I mean, I can look at your chart here. It talks about the first use of wooden spears and blade tools. Now, here I am, the proud owner of a megalodon tooth. If I'm an ancient guy or gal and I find a megalodon tooth, that's going to be a fantastic tool. I'm curious if we're able to tell in the fossil record, when did our ancestors start using these fantastic fossils that they were surely finding well before we were? Obviously, we weren't here. They were finding these fossils and they must have become tools for many of them.
Yeah, so the use of bone tools is really difficult. But let me back up one second and just point out that we have hundreds of thousands of examples of stone tools, maybe even 1 million or more. And we know a lot about how they were made and how they're constructed. Up until about 10 to 20,000 years ago, there is no evidence of a gender bias in tool use, right? So males and females both made and both used tools, which is very different from today in some cases. Okay, but I just had to bring that back in.
That basically means it's like, hey, the ladies were out on the savannas throwing those spears too.
Well, it depends. They were probably throwing the shorter spears, but as we get really big spears, which is much more recent, you need better upper body strength. And here's where you get some differences. But small spears, rocks, and creating and making tools. Remember, the tool landscape is huge, using all sorts of stuff. When we get really big giant things, like a big giant spear that you used to poke a bear or a mastodon, you would think that's mostly males. But some data from Neanderthal sites say that at least in the Neanderthals, both males and females have the same patterns of injuries. So it looks like they were both out there trying to stab really large things with short sticks.
Before we even go back to fossil tools, bone tools, you talk about using spears to try and kill a mastodon or whatnot. Now think about the creativity and collaboration that had to have unfolded to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, so I give that whole little, make-believe possible story about a group together sort of working out how to go from a stabbing spear to a throwing spear. And that whole idea takes trial and error. It probably failed or showed up and disappeared in groups all the time. But eventually some groups figured out that if you position yourself right and you hurl these spears at something, a few will stick, and you're going to have a much better chance at knocking down this prey without even getting close to them. And so the way in which that is figured out, right, that's sort of almost not just about group working together, but it's also a kind of inherent physics, right? That you have to figure out how to throw things, how to build things to throw them, all those kinds of things. It's just amazing. And again, nothing else on the planet has ever done it. And so we short sell ourselves. We don't think a bunch of things getting together and hurling spears at a zebra is particularly impressive. But when you step back and think of all the steps, all the creativity, all the collaboration, all the working together that takes, it floors you.
This is going to be kind of one really out of left field for you. And here I'm listening to you talk about this, and I'm thinking, okay, we're talking about spears into a mastodon or whatnot, and we're stick with that example for a moment. When did this start to get documented? Because instead of just the oral translation to people, the apprenticeship, when did we start to kind of create the cookbook for doing the spear throwing? Try and paint that together for the audience.
Okay, so there's 3 stages to this. The first stage is just learning, right? We don't have language, but we have a great way to sort of gesture and communicate and show and to sort of do this apprentice thing where you basically mold people's hands. You take them with you, right? You take the young of the group with you on a hunt and show them how to do it and convey that information. So that's the first thing. And that is similar. There's other organisms that do that. Killer whales, elephants, chimpanzees, they're able to at least sort of inculcate their young into the way of life of hunting or something like that. But the second stage here, and this is probably in the last 500,000 years or so, and this is when we start to see big game hunting showing up, we probably got some rudimentary form of language where you're not just sort of training through touching and showing and demonstrating, but you're also conveying a little bit more of what might be, what could happen. being able to talk and indicate things in the future. Okay, so you're going to go over there and wait for me as I chase the deer towards you. These kinds of things. And so what happens is it's not a written down, it's not a cookbook, but it's a poem. It's a myth. It's a story, right? Once we start to get that capacity, then things really start to pick up. Once we can tell stories, once we can convey information through language, the whole world shifts. And what you're talking about, these kind of cookbooks, rules, understandings, and possibilities really expand. But the final stage is hilarious because the final stage is not writing. Writing is in only the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. That's nothing. The final stage is in the last couple 100,000 years when we start to see carvings, and in the last 100,000 years or so when we start to see paintings and figurines. When we start to have the capacity to take our imagination of something that is totally made up and recreate it in the real world. It's the sort of learning and showing, then it's the language, then it's the art.
Well, hold on. Before I even go to language, you've just got too many topics here to interest me too much. We're at the fossil tool, and I kind of interrupted you. You were talking about the stone tools, and we wanted to. You were going to give a thought on the fossil tools.
So you think about this bone tool. So fossils are like rocks. So if you found a fossil, it'd be like a rock, and you could work it like a rock. Bone tools, though, are more flexible. They're harder to work with, right? To make, but they can be much sharper and have much better points. And really, it's in the last couple, 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 years that we start to see regular use of bone tools. And that's really important because that means you're killing something, you're taking the fur and wearing it, you're eating all the meat, you're using the sinew maybe as glues or to tie things together. But then you have the imagination and the creativity to say, hey, look at all these bones. You know what? If we break it here, if we sharpen this edge, if we carve it down here, we can create these very small, very sharp, very plastic or flexible tools. It's a complete advance. Once we see those starting to appear, they start to become ubiquitous and give us options of things like needles, right, for sewing, or different kinds of very small tools, fish hooks, stuff like that. They become really, really powerful in changing how we live in the world. So bone tools are a big advance.
Let me give the shout out to your book too, because if people really want to see some serious research, I don't know how many years this took you. I mean, seriously, you have jammed it in there. This is a serious deep dive. Let's go into something which I think is just a fantastic in terms of cooperation, in terms of creativity, language, and the spoken word. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, and I want you to kind of map this out. If I'm completely out of my mind, I'm pretty sure I read this, that language developed, or at least the way people speak, they were influenced, and again, please don't kill me if I'm out of my mind here, primates and birds, and that different groups of humans around the world were influenced by these different animal sounds.
No, it's not wrong. There are two things going on here. One is that we are primates, so all the stuff that is sort of patterned in primate communication, we have that. We had that as a baseline to start from, right, to expand on. We have expanded on the capacity of primates because primates are pretty good at communicators. We're just much better, but we've used all those basic primate things. The second thing, though, is that peoples around the world, and this is probably really old, we have recent evidence of it, but we don't have evidence of it in deep time because nothing was written down. People have taken the sounds around them, particularly things like bird calls or other animals that make melodic sounds, and incorporated those into their worlds, used them to sort of think through how they imagine the world to be. It's not just language, it's actually the way in which we see and perceive the world is influenced by things that make sounds that we find interesting. So I think that's that. Think of the wolf howl. Think of how pervasive that is in so many stories and myths. Why? Because it's awesome and creepy at the same time, terrifying and interesting. And it belongs to the ancestor of our best friend.
Here's one that I've experienced in the last handful of years is being in a culture where there's a 6-tone language. When you're in a culture that is a 6-tone language, what people, and look, I don't speak the language, but what people might not understand about this is that the ability to sing is off the charts. The ability to get to, quote, perfect pitch, not because they were, quote, born with it, but the environment shapes them from day one, but their ability to get to this perfect pitch is amazing. Look, to try and cut to the chase, if somebody was to go and listen to, in person, a Vietnamese woman sing, it's crazy. You're mesmerized. I've walked into malls and you just go, my gosh, what is going on here? Again, where did that start? I sometimes listen to people speak and I say, my gosh, I think I'm hearing birds speak. And I don't say that in a negative way.
No. And that's, we underestimate how amazing humans are. So by about 400,000 years ago, our brains had reached sort of the size that they are now, right? So the connections that were necessary for speech were there. At the same time, right about the same time, the our inner ear had evolved a particular shape that is perfect for hearing the range of all spoken human language today. We were set up for language at that time. We also start to see around that time evidence of the first early glimmerings of evidence of symbol or art or things like that. Why am I setting this all up? Because you talked about singing and the range of language, and we tend to think of these things as sort of functional, like the way our voices work, or we just think of them as doing something, but we forget that they also reflect this incredible capacity for creativity that we have. Languages are one of the best ways, and tonal languages are incredible because if you're not used to a tonal language and you go in there, like for me, I have trouble hearing some of the tones, but then when you start to hear them, you're like, whoa, I didn't even know these sounds existed in this relation to one another.
Us apes in America don't hear any of this.
But I mean, what's amazing is it just is another indication of how incredibly plastic and diverse the human ability is and are. So there are many, many ways to be a successful human. And I think we underplay that. And that's one of the things that looking into our evolutionary history points out, that diversity is the norm for humans. We just all live in our own little groups, and we don't actually get a chance to look around the planet and see how absolutely creative, imaginative, and amazing diversity is.
One of the best things that I've ever done, I did not plan it, going to a place entirely diverse on the other side of the planet. Look, I can still walk out, and there's a Circle K, and if I want to drink a Coke, I can drink a Coke, okay? But if you look a little bit deeper, that doesn't take much effort, you'll see, wow, okay, yes, there's all kinds of similarities, but there's still some radical diversity too.
And that's beautiful, and that's actually one of the reasons we made it, right? If you think 2 million years ago about our ancestors, small, hairless, fangless, hornless, no claws, what did they have? They had some rocks and sticks, and they had each other and a capacity for creative collaboration, for incredible imagination. And when we look around the planet, we see that humans have spread everywhere, and everywhere they've spread, they've figured out how to make it work. They've figured out how to mess with the land, to reshape it to their own benefit and to the benefit and debt. But I think everyone in 6th grade or something should have to take a trip around the planet. It would just really, really improve the world.
Date the language, though, the vocalization, the use of language, something with, many words. When do we know this happened beyond grunts? Do we know? Do we have a date rough range?
No. And that's the most frustrating thing. Without a time machine, you can't do it. But we have material stuff. So we have some tools and some symbolic things like works of art that are so complicated that we can't imagine they're done without language, right? So, for example, 46,000 years ago, there's this beautiful figurine that's half lion and half man. How do you make that without being able to talk about it? I'm sure you can't. 200,000 years ago in South Africa, groups were mixing together tree sap and milk and heating it up and mixing some stuff up to make glue. How does that happen without language? I don't think it does. But we don't have any direct cues, all right? You can't say, yes, language was there because language itself doesn't fossilize. By 400,000 years ago, everything was set for language. But did we have it? We just can't tell.
I'm so happy as a complete novice to ask, as my last question, one of the most important ones apparently, that we can't answer.
Well, but this is what's so exciting about science, right? I mean, any scientist who tells you they understand everything and they have all the answers is lying. That's the fun part. We'll let philosophers and religious folks tell us the way the world is. What a good scientist does is say, here's what we know about the world. Here are the questions that remain. Let's dive in. Let's dig in and really try to figure this stuff out. That's not to say we can't learn something from it, right? By looking to the past, it informs us about the present, but it helps us imagine much better and more exciting futures.
This is what's fun about these kinds of conversations, because in such a polarized world and polarized countries, and people have got all of these modern hang-ups about this and that. But, if you just kind of reframe what your focus is, there's so much fun out there. It doesn't all have to be, crazy stuff. The book, The Creative Spark, How Imagination Made Humans Exceptional, is available everywhere. People should check it out. Hey, is there a website we can send people to?
Yeah, you can send to my website, afuentes.com, but most important, follow me on Twitter at anthrofuentes. The Creative Spark also is available in Spanish, Romanian, Korean, and Chinese.
If you've already got 4 or 5, there's going to be more. That's the way it works. Everybody starts competing to get their translation in. Best of luck, man. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much. It was a great chat.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.